Welcome to Level Up Conversations presented by TEDxYYC in partnership with First Calgary Financial. In keeping with the TED mission of ideas worth spreading, our guests today are Todd Hirsch, Chief Economist for ATB Financial, and Chad Park, Lead Animator of the Energy Futures Lab. Our discussion today, COVID and facing the future of Alberta's economy. Please welcome host Tim Tamashiro. Hello, everybody. Welcome to TEDxYYC's Level Up Conversations. My name's Tim Tamashiro. It's a real pleasure to be here with you today during your lunch hour. We've got some really interesting things to talk about today. And as you know, the mission of TEDx and TED in general is ideas worth spreading. And goodness knows there's a lot of ideas floating around in our Alberta economy right now because of two factors, COVID and also, all of our economy. So joining us today, we have two wonderful guests, and our guests are Todd Hirsch and Chad Park, joining us here, both from Calgary, right?
I'm in Edmonton, actually.
Oh, you're in Edmonton. Well, there we go. We have somebody from the north end of the country. Chad Park is the lead animator of Energy Futures Lab, and Todd Hirsch is the chief economist for ATB Financial. Real stressful time for both of you, or no?
Well, it's had its ups and downs for sure, but making it through okay. Yep.
Yeah. How about you, Chad? Is this a stressful time for you, or is it one of the times where you just kind of go, well, we'll do whatever we can do?
Yeah, I'd say a little of both there, Tim. I mean, it's disruptive, that's for sure, but I also find it's opening up all kinds of possibilities as well. So there's that kind of stress, there's nervousness, there's also excitement about some of those possibilities.
Possibilities, there you go. Well, so the world right now literally has 1 trillion problems that we're dealing with as far as COVID and the economy. But Alberta has its own, special set of circumstances. Todd, how do you kind of envision or describe the current state of Alberta's economy?
Yeah, well, there's not really a nice way to sugarcoat it. This is the worst downturn that Alberta is going into that any of us have ever seen in our lives. The closest probably would be the Great Depression of the 1930s. Mm-hmm. Now, it's possible some of the listeners would have been alive during that time, but none of us would have lived through it as adults, for sure. And that is the kind of contraction in the GDP we're looking at. However, that's the dismal side of it. But I do think, and we can get into some of these topics, I do think, as Chad kind of alluded to, there's some possibilities, there's some bright spots. And coming out of COVID, I tend to be optimistic about some of the societal and economic changes that we could be in store.
Yeah, and I'll be excited to learn a little bit more about what your thoughts are here. Chad, I wanted to ask you the same question before we kind of split off and talk separately here. How do you describe the current state of Alberta's economy?
Well, I think Todd described it very well, and I was going to say it's in turmoil. The challenges just seem to be coming at us from all kinds of different directions and blowing the economy in a lot of different directions. And so I think, in that context, it can be hard to know which way is up and which way is the right way forward. So I think there's no doubt it's complex and there are a lot of pressures and there's a lot of uncertainty, and that can also lead to a lot of fear.
Yeah.
I mean, those are the contexts that's the context that we have to deal with, and we're talking about how we can address these issues.
Yeah, for sure. Well, I appreciate you both being on the show and providing your realistic perspectives as we move forward. Chad, if you'll excuse me, I'm going to go into the room and just speak directly with Todd Hirsch here for a little bit. Excuse me as I push a couple of buttons. And there's Todd Hirsch along with me now. Todd, thank you very much for being on the show. So we have a couple of factors that applies directly to Alberta. We have COVID shutting down the general economy, but we also have this challenging situation with the energy sector. So tell me, why is it? I'm going to just jump right in with both feet.
Yeah.
How is it that Russia and Saudi Arabia can flood the international market with oil just before COVID? And how is this not considered price fixing?
Well, it really is sort of considered price fixing. I mean, when OPEC was established decades ago, that's what it was meant to do. It's a cartel, and usually the cartel is meant to push prices higher. They restricted supply, and that was the problem that America had and Canada had back in the day when in the 70s, the oil crisis, because OPEC was restricting oil, keeping prices sky high. Today, they're doing a little bit the opposite. They're pushing oil out the door. Now, they've curtailed a little bit of that in the last few months, but back in March, basically opening the floodgates and pushing as much oil out. The intent is to push price down and weed out their competitors, which namely would be the U.S. shale producers.
So do you think that Alberta was in their sights as far as being a competitor?
Not particularly. I mean, Canada, we produce about 4% of global oil supplies. So we're kind of in there as a small player. But really the target was the United States, which over the last 10 or 15 years has gone from, a kind of I don't want to say a smaller producer, but today they are the world's largest producer of oil. Yeah. And that was really their target. They were not too happy with U.S. shale oil competing on global markets, so they colluded. They said, let's push price way down and weed them out. And it's been pretty effective.
Wow. Well, that's a pretty bold, like that's coming out with both dukes swinging, right?
Absolutely. And the sad part is Canada and Alberta were just sort of collateral damage in this. I'm sure Saudi Arabia and Russia, they're aware of Canada, but the target's really the U.S. producers. And we're just kind of unfortunate victims in this drive-by shooting.
Well, and that was the battle cry again. Well, I don't want to say battle cry, but that was what President Trump really wanted to do, was to be able to ensure that they could get more oil from local sources and to ensure, America first in terms of oil. But now we are on the receiving end of it, being Albertan, and it doesn't feel like a nice stroke to be collateral damage.
Yeah, that's right. And President Trump, he's kind of in an awkward spot because on one hand, cheap oil is actually really helpful for the global economy, for consumers. I'm sure every listener, when they fill up their car for gas, they don't mind that gasoline is a lot less expensive than it used to be. But for the United States, which is now a major oil producer, if those shale producers get shut out because the price is too low, that's bad news for them, and it risks the U.S. being self-sufficient in oil.
Yeah. So then what is the way forward? All business in the province is being affected. We all need to recover in whatever business we're in, from the restaurant industry to the arts to oil and energy to natural resources to health and welfare. I mean, what is the way forward? And is it really fair to prioritize the energy sector at this point?
Well, I guess if COVID has done one thing, and it's done a lot of things, but it's highlighted one more time for Alberta our dependence on the energy sector. And people can get into all sorts of debates about should we have done more to diversify and all those questions, but we've allowed ourselves to be painted into this very uncomfortable corner where going into 2020, we are still very dependent on hydrocarbons. That has enriched this province and led to a very high standard of living. But we find that, when something like global oil prices are beyond our control, we get whipsawed either way. And this time it's whipsawed down. So the question you pose, what's the way forward? Every industry is really being affected. The energy industry particularly. I would also say the tourism industry is just getting absolutely hammered, which is really sad because 3 or 4 months ago, I was talking about the tourism industry as one of the bright lights in the province, looking at yet another record year of growth in 2020. That has gone, they've gone from hero to zero, no fault of their own. And rebuilding that tourism industry is going to take a little while.
It will, and there again, this is part of Alberta's own, I guess you could call it blue ocean strategy. Is that you can't go and visit Banff or the Rocky Mountains or the Tyrrell Museum or all these other communities anywhere else in the entire world. So therein lies part of our I guess our benefit. But how do you bounce back from that when there is literally every single tourism industry is affected in the exact same way?
Yeah, that's the big question. Every boardroom right now in every industry association, and I sit on a couple of different boards of some arts organizations, and they're all having this existential moment. How do we pivot? Can we pivot? Do we have a future? How do we get through, especially the next year or two? And it's especially, challenging because most industries in Alberta, maybe tourism accepted, but, Alberta came into this COVID downturn already compromised as an economy. Mm-hmm. That wasn't the case. The rest of the country was actually doing pretty well. Central Canada, BC, they had, 40-year low unemployment rates. Alberta was not in that situation. We came kind of crawling on hands and knees into 2020, hoping that 2020 was going to be a little bit better, and then COVID hit. So, we're already compromised as an economy going into it, and that's what's going to make it even more challenging for a lot of these industries and a lot of these companies.
Do you see boards coming together, industry boards now coming together to be able to kind of find ways forward so that it's going to benefit the entire economy? And again, I don't want to paint the energy sector as the bad guy or as the good guy for any stretch of the imagination, but a large section of attention is being paid to the energy sector. Well, how is it that we can come together as citizens and try to lift the entire economy together?
Well, yeah, that's a great question too. I do see, within the energy sector itself, I do see lots of conversations going on right now. Conversations that I hadn't heard in the last 5 years. The last 5 years, there were a lot of conversations about, well, we just need a pipeline and we just need oil to get back to, whatever. Now there are more serious questions calling into discussion. What is the future of the Canadian energy industry at all? Can we maybe incorporate elements of renewable energy? Can we pivot? And even the federal government's program with the orphaned well reclamation. All of those things, I think, are the conversations that I'm encouraged by. No single one of those conversations is going to cure the problem. It's going to have to be a series of conversations. But I am encouraged because I'm hearing more and more of it from the energy sector.
Yeah. And then what are you hearing in terms of small business? Even just mom and pop operations being able to get back to work and to be able to offer their products and services back to the Alberta citizens. What are you hearing in terms of support for them?
Well, the sad reality is, and I hate talking about this, but many of those businesses are just not going to make it back. And we just have to kind of understand that and in a way accept it because, again, so many of them were barely holding on, especially, I think about people in the restaurant industry, a very, very tough industry, even in good days. Yeah. And so many of them through 2019, which was a tough year. So I think we just have to accept that we are going to have fewer businesses. That is very sad. I don't say that with any kind of lightness at all. It's very sad because people are losing, in some cases, what they've poured their entire lives into. So that is the reality.
Yeah, it is a sad reality. I hate even just bringing it up, but so moving forward now. We have governments that are, the government is in place and the government's work is to be able to ensure that they provide services for citizens through taxes. Is it even viable now to start considering a provincial sales tax now as far as Alberta is concerned in order to be able to, forge a path forward?
Well, in the immediate crisis, I would say no. There is a time for that conversation, and I think that will come in 2021. Because we are going to have to figure out ways. How do we pay for this? That was actually the title of my blog I released today.
Yeah.
There's a few options that we have to pay for it, but generating higher tax revenue is one. No one likes the idea of that. Economists, we tend to like the idea in principle of a consumption tax for a lot of different reasons. But today and even this spring, this summer is not the time for that conversation. The time for that conversation will come. The metaphor I love using here is, when the house is on fire, the fire trucks arrive and you douse that home with flame or with water. You don't at that moment have the conversation about the damage the water might be doing to the furniture, or how are we going, what's going to happen to the floor if it gets wet. Those conversations will happen eventually, but not today.
Not today. We have a question from Clark online on Facebook for you, Todd. The question is, does Todd see any parallels between Detroit's experience with their major industry declining and moving to countries?
Moving countries?
Yeah.
I'm not sure.
Sorry,
is the question about comparisons between Detroit's
experience with their major industries declining and moving to countries. I don't know exactly what that means, but essentially, I guess Detroit had a major experience with their industry declining, and how are they kind of fighting their way back? I guess it's just a tall of an order, I guess.
There's been a lot of comparisons, even long before COVID, between Calgary, maybe Alberta generally, and Detroit. In other words, a region or a city that is singularly focused on one industry, and what happens when that industry goes away or transitions into something else. I think, and I've done a little bit of reading about that, and I think the comparisons are interesting, but they're limited. Detroit and its long-term economic downturn was not just about the auto industry, although that played a big role. Mm. It was also about racism. It was also about white people fleeing from Detroit. There were a lot of really, really complicated things going on in that city over the last half of the 20th century, which led Detroit into the situation it's in. Yeah. And those aren't necessarily the problems that we're dealing with here in Alberta. So I would say that the lessons of Detroit and maybe some of the comparisons are interesting, but I would limit how much of a comparison or a parallel there is.
Yeah. So I guess just to clarify the question, it was about how major industries decided to leave the country and to go and seek I guess employees and the workforce in other countries that might have been cheaper. But again, we live here in Alberta. So our services and small business and energy sector is going to be coming from here. So we can't really pack it up and move it anywhere, obviously, right?
That's right.
Yeah.
But it is something that, the manufacturing sector in general, and so not just Detroit, but most of the Rust Belt of America and Southern Ontario went through this. Southern Ontario, not Toronto, the CMA of Greater Toronto, but Southern Ontario really went through a downturn through the 80s and 90s and into the 2000s for the same reason that the Rust Belt, they lost a lot of manufacturing to overseas. Yeah. So they went through a downturn as well.
So what's your feeling then from I hate to say this whole go forward kind of basis, because I know that nobody has a crystal ball. Are you getting any sort of an indication or a gut feeling from industry about the doors opening again and getting back to whatever normal is going to be?
I think there is a general acceptance that we're not going back to normal. What comes next, in some ways we can be optimistic about, and we can get into some of those topics, but the world is going, in a lot of ways, it's going to look different. Yeah. So just getting back to normal, that would be the type of thing you would maybe do when there was, say, a flood, the floods in Calgary in 2016 or 2014. Then you can say, well, the floodwaters recede, we rebuild our business, and we get back to normal. This is something bigger, and most industries, they don't have an old normal to go back to. They can only go forward. That future is a little bit foggy at the moment, but it does exist, and that's what we have to try to move towards.
I'm going to bring Chad Park into our conversation here because, Chad, you had an interesting quote where you said that it's pretty dangerous to drive forward while looking in the rearview mirror. And
Yeah.
this is exactly what Todd Hirsch and I are talking about right now, So what does going forward look like to you without looking in the rearview mirror?
Yeah, I definitely agree with Todd that there's no going back to quote unquote normal at this point. And I think there is a real danger to us kind of thinking or expecting that might be the case or that might be possible. I think the good news is, I mean, the opportunity is when markets change dramatically and when the context changes dramatically, it creates openings in a system for new ways of meeting human needs, new ways of meeting demands. And so I think that really means that what we're facing is ultimately, I mean, as we get our way through this, is going to be a big entrepreneurial challenge. Who are
Yeah.
the new entrepreneurs who are going to find new ways to meet the needs that our needs today are the same as they were 2 months ago, but we're going to have different ways of meeting those needs, and that's entrepreneurship. There's going to be a great opportunity for the really creative entrepreneurs who can find ways to do that.
And and just before we wrap up with Todd here, I wanted to ask both of you: are you starting to see a sense? I know it's only been like what 8 weeks, but are you starting to see those little hints, those little glimmers of entrepreneurship starting to pop up in ways that seem promising? And maybe it's too early to tell. Todd, can you comment on that?
Well, yeah, kind of at a small scale, but I know we've seen how restaurants, for example, a lot of them have been able to pivot very quickly and sort of change their whole business model by becoming food delivery and curbside pickup, something that most of them were not really oriented towards at the beginning. But they've been able to figure it out, a lot of them. And I think, they're all struggling. I don't want to make it sound like they're it's easy street, but a
Yeah.
lot of them have been able to use their entrepreneurial brain power, I guess, and figure it out and pivot. That's one example.
Yeah. Creativity is the way forward. Maybe that's we all got to start using the noggin in a brand new way in order to be able to connect the dots so that it's going to be meaningful for our customers and for our business, right? Yeah.
Right.
Todd, will you excuse me? I'm going to go over and talk to Chad for a little bit here, but
Absolutely.
fascinating ideas about what you're seeing out there. And again, I need to just make that point that nobody has a crystal ball. Goodness knows, this has got to be one of the most challenging time for any economist and any businessman or person in the entire world. So,
Yeah.
thanks for that information. I'm just going to go and talk to Chad here for a little bit. Chad Park, thank you very, very much. You're the lead animator for Energy Futures Lab, and you recently co-wrote this fascinating article for Medium, where you addressed Alberta's future economy by identifying some interesting ways forward. Hydrogen, geothermal energy, bitumen beyond combustion. These are potential growth industries. And this really leads into what you're just saying. There's a lot of innovation, a lot of creativity, and a lot of business acumen that is just starting to be planted.
Yeah, exactly. And the other thing about all those ideas that were in that article is that they all deliberately are about building from Alberta's existing and legacy strengths. In particular, in that case, the energy sector, the oil and gas sector. So again, it's not so much about let's go back to the way things were, even in the oil and gas sector, but how can we use the resources we have, the assets we have, the skill sets we've built, and find new ways to deploy them in a changing marketplace, and that's what those ideas were all compiled to be about.
So you have the entire Alberta energy sector, and we've been in a competition with the OPECs of the world and the Saudi Arabias and Russias and Americas and whatnot. Are you suggesting that maybe we can utilize these resources in order to create new industries, and we can create our own little blue ocean strategy? So maybe we just retain our own natural resources in order to build new services or new products for people around the world?
Yes, absolutely. And I'm not saying that that's going to happen overnight. It's
No.
not a switch you can flip right now. But if we can have some foresight about where are the markets going and what are people going to be, kind of energy system are people going to be wanting in the future, what kind of materials are people going to be wanting in the future, we need to start thinking about how we can use our assets today to be able to supply that market. So one good example, I think, is what you mentioned there, bitumen beyond combustion.
Mm-hmm.
Over the course of our many decades here, we've come to appreciate the oil sands, Alberta's very unique asset, as a great source of wealth and prosperity, of course. And there's some inherent liabilities with that that are becoming more challenging in the sense that our bitumen resource is very carbon intensive, and we've had to work hard at trying to reduce the carbon emissions from that, for example, because of climate change and the way demands are shifting. But we can flip the thinking about that bitumen resource and think about the carbon intensity of bitumen not as a problem we have to try to avoid, but as an asset. If we think about different uses for bitumen. So Alberta Innovates, for example, has launched a grand challenge, a grand innovation challenge, $15 million challenge to look at alternative uses for bitumen beyond burning it. For example, carbon fibers.
Mm-hmm.
So carbon, if we could take that carbon intense resource of bitumen and turn it into a product like carbon fibers that is increasingly being used in all kinds of different materials around the world, then we can start to take a piece of world markets for things like steel with our carbon fibers that have been generated from our bitumen resource. And that's not going to solve the problem, and we're not going to get there right away. But those are the kinds of things I think that we need to be thinking about for how we diversify, but diversification from the basis of some of our existing strengths.
Yeah, and carbon fibers. That was the reason why I wanted to include the bitumen beyond combustion, because you can use our national resources, our products that we're getting from northern Alberta to create new things. And as you mentioned in your article, carbon. Especially carbon fibers are a lot stronger. They last for 200 years or something along those lines. So you get stronger. You get is it cheaper to build with the?
Yep. I mean, if we can get it there, there's the possibility of it being cheaper, and then also it's more lightweight compared to a lot of the materials they would replace. So you could imagine supplying, car manufacturers with carbon fiber based materials that is lighter than steel. And therefore, requires less fuel to power those vehicles. That's the kind of thinking that we could pursue with ideas like that.
It really is. It blew my mind when I was reading your article at the variety of different ways that we could move forward in Alberta. But we have to kind of start thinking then in terms of how do we use our natural resources to create products and services for people that are in demand. And I guess that's the big question, how do we pivot from being an exporter to a manufacturer? Is that kind of the question?
That would be part of it for that. It might also be that it creates opportunities to be an exporter of other things, an exporter of expertise, an exporter of, of new materials and new technologies, of engineering know-how, which we are right now, but this could create new opportunities in that space as well.
I wanted to address your thoughts on geothermal energy, and this is an opportunity for us to start thinking in terms of being an energy producer, but electricity, I guess. Is that basically what you're kind of leaning towards?
Electricity or heat as well.
Heat.
Good opportunity. Yeah, and the great thing about geothermal, again, none of these are the silver bullet that's going to solve everything. But it's, if we piece together a few such opportunity areas, then you start to look at some diversification and some innovation pathways to pursue. With geothermal, there's a great opportunity to make use of all the drilling capacity and skill sets of our energy industry, but to apply it in a different way when we're drilling wells for geothermal energy, and or take even in some cases making use of existing wells. So there's I think that's one of the areas where there could be real opportunity to create jobs in the short term, not just the long term.
What's the industry? How is the industry embracing these new ideas so far, or is it too early to tell that maybe some of the energy producers would make shifts or starting to make shifts so that you can turn that into a viable business?
I do think it's early days for a lot of this, but I would also agree with what Todd said earlier, which is that this shift in the situation we're in right now has really forced some broader thinking, let's say, about the possibilities and the needs for different approaches. So, I mean, with the Energy Futures Lab, we've been involved and engaged with a broad range of organizations, oil and gas companies, clean tech companies, renewable energy, also environmental groups and so on, working on developing some of these kind of solutions for years now. But in the last couple of months, I would say there's been a heightened level of interest in them. And I think that's maybe logical when you realize that a certain pathway is presenting some obstacles and barriers. You can't help but open yourself up to new possibilities.
Yeah.
It's certainly not the case for everyone, but there are great examples that have already surfaced of companies that are really kind of looking for different possibilities and opening themselves up.
There is just news recently, and I know that both you and Todd have commented on Twitter about it, is the fact that there are some investment companies now that are just turning right away from Alberta energy investments, saying that I don't know, how do you sum up why they're I don't want to put words in anybody's mouths. How do you sum up why they're saying that they don't want to invest in Alberta's energy sector any longer?
Well, I mean, the divestment campaigns, as they refer to them, are at least partially based on the idea that we need to get off of fossil fuels, and then in some cases, even in particular, we don't want to invest in Alberta's oil sands because they see it as a higher carbon product. So that's kind of the driver for some of that. And I think the reality is that investors are concerned about climate change, as one would be when one's managing billions and trillions of dollars, and see the economic risks that are associated with climate change coming. So I think the real challenge for Alberta, and it's not out of our reach at all, is to position ourselves as part of the solution, not part of the problem. And that's partly about the story we tell. So there's no denying that. But it's also about where we focus and how we perform and what we put our effort into. And there's an emerging category of finance among these global investors who are concerned about climate change that's called transition finance. And I think Alberta stands to be a really good target for such investment if we play our cards right.
Yeah, I want to bring Todd Hirsch back into this conversation here, because I see a lot of nodding happening about what do you call it? Transition financing? Todd, what are you hearing in terms of transition financing, so that maybe we can move towards a little bit towards new industries?
Well, the transition financing that's out there, and I think we need to maybe find new ways, new venues to increase that. Maybe some venture capital is always a challenge, but that is what forward-looking companies and forward-looking organizations and industries are going to be tapping into. And in a way, I'm fascinated listening to both of you talk, and the metaphor that comes to my mind, with the whole COVID, maybe, to be generous to it, in 10 years, if we could look back on 2020 and say, in a lot of ways, that was the smack upside the head we needed, the bucket of cold water, which is very unpleasant at the time. And I don't want to suggest anyone in Alberta has been, lazy, but in a way, we've been sort of sleepwalking our way through this, trying to double down on our energy sector and get things back to how they used to be. And now we've been shocked into a new reality. And that shock is very unpleasant while we're going through it. But my hope is that in 2030, we look back on it and say, boy, that COVID, that was really the trigger that started to, we saw this explosion of new industries and new ways of thinking about the Canadian energy industry in all of the ways Chad's been talking about.
Yeah. Well, and that's the one. I think this is the one phrase that I'm really encouraged about that you have both kind of chatted about, is that transition financing. Do you think that this is going to be a bit of a buzzword now, a buzz phrase moving forward?
There's some research, Tim, that talks about how the word transition in itself can be a very polarizing word because depending on how you, I happen to be a fan of it as well, but depending on where you sit and what your kind of lens is, you may not like the notion that you're being transitioned off of something, for example. So I think that transition and transition finance is great if and when we're thinking about how do we transition from the system we've had to the one that the future requires of us.
Yeah.
And that's not necessarily, as the sort of shorthand might be, well, how do we transition from oil and gas to renewable energy, for example, in some people's eyes. I think that's, of course, part of it, but it's actually much more nuanced than that. It's about some of the things we were talking about earlier, like how do we leverage our resources in a way so we transition to the economy and the energy system that the future requires of us. Then I find it pretty compelling as well. And there's lots of opportunity in that transition space, in the same way we were talking about earlier, that it's going to be entrepreneurial. There's going to be new ways to do things.
Yeah. It's thanks for pointing out that the word transition is a polarizing word. I hadn't thought about that. I guess then, there's got to be a lot of branding people out there, comes saying, well, we're transitioning toward, instead of transitioning back, or, goodness knows, there's so many different things to kind of think about, right?
Well, and a lot of the reason that we're transition, I'd agree, is polarizing is because, especially pre-COVID, if you talked about, well, we need to transition our economy, we get a lot of people saying, no, we don't. What we need to do is solve some political problems and get rid of certain individuals out of office. And they would see that as the solution going forward. They saw Alberta's problems as political, that could be solved by changing leadership. And I would concede there may have been some things that could have been done better by all players, for sure. But COVID has revealed the problem we're seeing in Alberta is bigger than just replacing somebody at 24 Sussex. The problems we are facing are much, much bigger, and transition does not need to be a polarizing word, or it shouldn't be. We understand we have no choice but to transition. You can only move forward, and you can't just go back by changing a few political leaders.
That's for sure. And on that note, I'm wondering if we can maybe just kind of wrap it up there. There's just so many ideas that are still yet to come. And personally, I'm encouraged by that. I think that this is a time, as you've said, Todd, where it really is a knock upside the head going, come on, let's get it figured out. But our challenges are not unique to just us, and I guess therein lies part of the solution, is that we're really going to have to depend on others in order to be able to, other countries, other economies, other ideas, other creators, creations, whatever the case, in order to be able to move this forward. And I really appreciate both your points of view on how we're going to move forward. Chad, would you like to wrap up with any thought that you might have missed?
Thanks, Tim, and thanks, Todd. The one thing I think I would say, I agree with what you just said, Tim, is that we have the capacities and the skills in Alberta to do what you're talking about. I am so encouraged by the innovators and the strategic thinkers, and the entrepreneurs and so on, the technology developers that we have in this province, and who understand all the issues that we're talking about here and are busy working largely out of the public eye on the solutions. And so I think we really need to kind of invest in those people and those organizations and create the right kind of public dialogue and support to really highlight the work of the innovators like that. And that is the thing that I find the most encouraging.
Yeah. How about you, Todd? Do you have any parting thoughts that you might be able to offer?
Well, I guess the only thought maybe I would offer, I've been impressed over the COVID days. I've been able to do a lot of reading. I'm reading a book called The Third Pillar, and it's by, I forget the author's first name, but Dr. Rajan. He used to be the head of the IMF. He's a business professor at the University of Chicago. He used to head up the central bank in India. This is an economist through and through, but the subtitle of the book is How Markets and Government Have Left Community Behind. And he says, we don't want to demonize the market economy. We don't want to demonize capitalism too much. That is an essential element to our society. But when it gets out of balance, when it becomes too dominant and powerful, bad things start to happen. Same with government. You don't want to, diss the government too much. It plays an essential role, but it too, when it gets out of balance, when it becomes too dominant, bad things can happen. But he really then talks about the third and maybe the neglected pillar of the three-legged stool, and that is community. And how we need all three of these things in equal balance: market economy, government, and community to solve problems. And my hope, now this book came out in 2019. I would love to interview this author and get some of his sense right now of, what's going on. Is this COVID pandemic going to actually stimulate more of a sense of how important community is? I've been encouraged, even in the last 2 months, by seeing community coming together in really interesting and really new and exciting ways. So that's where I would leave the listeners to think about how might they reinvigorate their thinking around community as that third pillar.
It's the middle way.
It's the middle way.
You
know, and Tim, you know this. I mean, art and culture has a lot to play around community.
Oh, sure.
And drawing people together that way.
Yeah, for sure. And I mean, not to bring faith into this, but the middle way is a central pillar of central thought of Buddhism. There is a middle way that can move everything forward.
And we need things in balance.
Yeah, move things in balance. That's exactly it. Yeah. Well, thank you both for being part of the Level Up conversations for TEDxYYC. I'm sure that there's a lot of people out there that are really benefiting and finding some comfort in your thoughts and your ideas for moving forward. And there will be a move. We will move forward. That's a good thing.
we will have no choice but to move forward.
Yeah, that's it. So I guess maybe we'll end this by going onward
and upward.
And upward. Thank you both so much for being part of our talk.
Yeah, thanks gentlemen.
I've enjoyed it very much. Stay well.
See you soon. Yeah, you bet.
Okay.